Hello, and welcome to episode number 6 of Gallivanting across British Cultural Studies, the final episode I'll be doing for this project. Today I'll be covering the 1978 book Policing the Crisis by Hall and his collaborators, which is a fundamental text for the entirety of British Cultural Studies. Policing the Crisis is an absolute monster of a text. Despite the relatively simple subject matter of the British mugging epidemic in the early 1970s, Hall and his Birmingham comrades paint an utterly comprehensive picture of its every aspect. Everything from the media and state apparatuses, to the implicit biases of British ideology, to the eventual galvanization of Thatcherism and similar far-right movements is discussed and analyzed in devastating detail across its near 500-page runtime. My version was complete with arguably the smallest font size and typeface imaginable, of course. This makes the work incredibly difficult to bring up in casual conversation or to cite any one aspect or conclusion. Each of the text's 10 chapters is filled to the brim with novel conclusions and analysis which could make up the contents of several journal collections all on their own. I read Policing the Crisis at the end of this project to better situate its contents within the context of British cultural studies. It's easy to see why Hall's project is often viewed as the definitive work of its kind. Nearly all of the conclusions and presumptions posited by the field make up the bedrock of much of the analysis, and we see the rare convergence of both textual and audience studies applied throughout. Policing the Crisis serves as an almost perfect encapsulation of the movement's methodologies, ideologies, political goals, and academic style. That being said, it's easy to see why a work of this magnitude has been seldom replicated since, as the sheer scope is not only daunting for consumers, but inefficient to produce for its authors. The book took the better part of a decade to complete and remains grounded in a historical footnote for most modern audiences. I know I personally had never heard of the mugging epidemic as it relates to Britain. A similar study could be conducted on just about any heavily mediatized subject, but to do so would almost seem superfluous due to the insane number of man-hours needed to produce solid work. We can still learn quite a bit from the text, though, in the analysis it provides, the number of useful methodologies pioneered, and as a rare example of how to empirically prove prescriptions from the humanities and social sciences. In previous episodes, I spent quite a lot of time summarizing individual chapters from Turner's text, and that's simply impossible with Policing the Crisis. Instead, I aim to provide a general overview of Hall's main points and argumentation. So, without further ado, let's start with Chapter 1, The Social History of a Moral Panic. We begin with the claim that the press invented the term mugging with a series of stories, one of which was concerned with 4 black youths from Birmingham, which led to an early intervention by Critcher in the start of the mugging project of the CCCS, or the Birmingham Center for Cultural Studies. See, mugging was never a legal term, or even something generally familiar to the British public, but it was naturalized and given statistical antecedents. A British police officer had just returned from the USA at the time and might have brought the term back with him. Nonetheless, press attention was focused by the courts issuing exemplary sentences in the name of public interest and public safety. Their justification was that there had been a rise in violent crime. After this, in the early 70s, police activity increased as a response, and a number of prominent figures intervened, including the Home Secretary and the Duke of Edinburgh. Public support grew, and the campaign for anti-mugging soon took on racial undertones, so that mugging became synonymous with street crimes committed by black youths. The book offers a criticism of each of these steps, offering a conclusion for each one. The statistics used were seen as ideological, for one, the courts were not indeed getting any softer, and long sentences were not an effective deterrent. Finally, mugging appeared to be a fluctuating phenomenon rather than a steadily growing one. The preferred analysis fits the notion of a moral panic, as in the work of S. Cohen. A threat appears, it is stereotyped in the media, moral entrepreneurs arise to condemn and explain it, the panic declines, and emerges into folk memory. Effects of that moral panic were real, however, which point to the importance of reactions to crime. Crime is not a simple disease nor a simple phenomenon, and these are all important neglected aspects of mugging. Hall then moves to the career of a label, or the importance of the term mugging itself, which has American origins. Like all labels, it mobilizes a referential context or possesses connotations. Mugging became a symbol for American social problems and social crisis involving anxieties about drugs, black people, urban crime, and so on, and the reaction to those problems from Nixon's silent majority. Crime then became a symptom of social disorder, leading to a defensive mentality among respectable white people. The American crisis was focused on by the British press, as usual. America was seen as the future for Europe. Press reporting here reproduced these already forged connections between crime, black people, and the decline of cities. So in this way, mugging and its connotations were made familiar to British people. The label was applied to Britain in a general sense before any concrete instances occurred, and there was finally a general process of translation and naturalization. The American future of Britain was still to come, but the rot was apparent in the soft morality of the 60s, and heavy sentences were called for to prevent further decline. Also note that, for a final common touch, a mildly anti-American note was apparent too. British audiences did not want to end like them. So the concept of mugging did have a career of progressive naturalization, but this wasn't based on any actual experience. It was already present in the public's consciousness in its most sensationalized form. There were already anti-black and anti-riot fears and panics in Britain at the time. Chapter 2, The Origins of Social Control, zooms out and seeks to explain how this moral panic and moral rot could take place in Britain. Building off the earlier point that crime could be seen as ideological, as a symbolic threat, Hall posits that ideological displacement is responsible for moral panics. Displacement is the work of the media, but actual work is done in courts, and so on, as well. There is a necessary passage from the closed institutional world of control culture to the form of society as a whole. The courts and the media collude to present certain crimes as abnormal. For example, a judge's remark about waves or epidemics of crime are seen as relevant and newsworthy by the media, and they are of course intended for the media. Further, there is an ideological consensus amongst judges with no counter-definitions. Specifically, there had been some reconstruction inside the law, following certain anxieties about permissiveness, summarizing from press reports about judges. The judiciary had been subject to attacks on permissive legislation, or lenient sentences, especially in terms of young offenders. To some extent, then, the panic was generated by the judiciary. The police also had a new interest in their public image under the leadership of the new chief constable of the Metropolitan Police, the controversial Sir Robert Mark. They too had structured and amplified events, and these activities had produced the crime waves in the first place. The press had constantly ignored the political aspects of black arrests too. Black people and underground elements had already been targeted by the police, leading to anticipatory arrests and the activities of special squads in black areas. Police activity then produced a self-fulfilling prophecy, especially as black youth was concerned. So the context of the issue of relations between the police and the black people was important. As a result, there was this new focus or new power dynamic. The notion of police versus blacks became the paradigmatic relation to the mugging phenomenon. It tapped into a long history, and the media helped explore the social side rather than the legal social control side. Leading to Chapter 3, the social production of news. This chapter is about how media works to articulate and structure public opinion. It begins with news values outlined by Cohen and Young or Galting and Rouge. The analysis then turns to how newsworthy events have to be novel but yet familiar, and how this exposes them to the overwhelming influence of dominant ideas, and how these ideas become fitted to the professional ideologies of news professionals. This isn't a conspiracy theory or one based on the class ownership of the media. The structures of news production are relatively autonomous, but they do reproduce the interests of the dominant groups in the last instance. Indeed, the media depend for their effect upon appearing as quoting authoritative sources and as obeying the rules of impartiality. This enables them to pose as mere representatives of opinion. The media lend legitimacy to the views of reality implicit in these official sources, and thus serve to symbolically reproduce the institutional order of society. The authorities become primary sources, able to set agendas, they command the field and set the terms of reference. For example, race relations are defined in terms of numbers of immigrants, and this is difficult to break out of those terms. Thus, in the moment of news production, the media stand in the position of structured subordination to the primary definers. This is how the media strengthen the role of ruling ideas. It's important to note that the media also transform. Work is performed on the raw materials provided by the powerful in order to turn them into news. This happens via a process of selection and coding into language forms, the media's version of the language of the public. Media products are different, but within the range set by ideological limits. So the media translate the views of primary definers into the public idiom, or into stock popular imagery. In this way, the link between everyday language and official discourse is disguised. The latter is popularized and then returned to the public, inflicted with dominance and consensual connotations. The media are neither free nor limited to simple reproduction. Instead, they transform. Also, editorials can function to show the range of opinions. They can represent the public or speak for the public. In this way, they can produce an amplification spiral, since powerful interests also read public opinion in the press. In this way, the press seems neutral, and this is the dark side of their independence. The concept of counter-definitions, or different frames of reality, are usually denied access or fitted into the dominant agenda, leading to strategic areas of silence. Because of this, the media can conflict with the state, as in investigatory journalism, but the prevailing tendency is to reproduce, amidst all their contradictions, the definitions of the powerful or dominant ideology. Crime makes the news and serves as a dramatized reassertion of the values of society. Crime itself is very newsworthy, fitting all the values listed by Galtung and Rouge, especially because of its perceived negative consequences. It's especially open to influential authoritative sources such as the police or the courts, as we just mentioned. Journalistic balance is not so appropriate in reporting crime, so there is more of a focus on what should be done rather than what causes it. In fact, the media themselves are a clear special influence on it. In covering crime, they often deal with it using images of pollution or stigma. And it's not merely coincidental that the language used to justify action against any group of potential troublemakers deploys the imagery of criminality and illegality directly or by association. The history of mugging is actually a good example. It had a cycle of mentions in the press, offering at first novel and then broader concerns, and often featuring bizarre and violent characteristics. So, new forms of exotic personal attack met the need for bizarre aspects, while violence was overrepresented for news purposes. The campaigns run by the British media outfit The Mirror, for example, demanded more power for the police, because there was a public concern over crime. And because of this, the courts could justify increased jail sentences because everyone knows that crime is on the increase because of what was in the press. It's this turd Ouroboros, if you will. An effective ideological and controlled closure. Chapter 4, Balancing Accounts, demonstrates how this plays out on a micro scale, showing how the media actually works by examining one of the key episodes in the mugging moral crusade, the one that occurred in Handsworth, that had been discussed earlier in Birmingham work. The media, both local and national, used the word mugging in their headlines to describe the events, although this wasn't used in courts, so as to ensure that the debate which followed would be heavily inferential and structured from the outset. One theme in the press was to contrast the youth of the offenders with the length of the sentences, which led to a discussion about appropriateness of the sentences. Most papers were in favor of long sentences, and they worked to link these long sentences to government thinking and the general law and order issue. There were differences in coverage, though. The Daily Telegraph focused on the rationality of the crime and then projected the issue as a judicial matter. The Daily Mirror dramatized and personalized and operated in moral common sense terms. It offered a balance by contrasting the points of view of the mother of a mugger and a spokesman from the police federation. So the balance was around youth versus sentences, but the definition of the issue ignored explanations and causes. Turning to explanations and ideologies, it's difficult to think of alternatives in crime and punishment, leading to copy in the Times on the general issues of law. The Telegraph discussed the general problems of crime, while the Daily Mail claimed the crimes were so savage that the sentences should be so too, invoking a theory of human nature and instincts. The Sun did offer a radical approach. This was before the Murdoch acquisition, of course, saying that society needed to be transformed rather than legal penalties increase, and discussed the toleration of special views of privileged writers as a form of institutionalized dissent. Yet, in each case, the concrete case itself was generalized. There is a general emphasis on the victim. Debate and conflict were ignored through empathy with the victim as a citizen. Thus, it became self-evident that savage punishment was required. The press mainly wrote this coverage in a one-dimensional language, which is immediate and direct rather than dealing with the concepts themselves. The background to each piece of coverage was, of course, gathered via the codes of journalism, focusing on people, places, and experiences. These ideologies place us in a familiar context. They normalize lay ideologies, especially in terms of the victim. They deny any and all background causes. The press established images of the offenders in features and in editorials. They were depraved, hardcore, possessing pathological tendencies. Through the notion of inadequate socialization, the issue itself was racialized too. Handsworth, the location of the crime, was blamed as a criminal patch, a ghetto, a place populated by immigrants. This raises the question of press balance. On occasion, muggers were balanced with victims, but the nasty associations attached to the former were already established. Generally, when the press did refer to the environments as associated with crime, they did so in order to complete a social circuit, a simple association rather than a set of complex links. The press generally preferred a vaguer, moral pollution explanation. The background cannot be explored because it's too political, so images are drawn rather than analyses pursued. Images of the ghetto, youth, and their families. This helps to localize the problem as well as popularize it, leading to easy solutions, especially moral ones. Chapter 5, Readers' Letters, pays special attention to just that. Letters of opinion written by the general public, highlighted by certain publications. In analyzing these, the team found that they offered another amplification spiral, operating between letters and news itself. Of course, the letters were specially selected themselves, offering a very specific notion of reality. Some letters referred to brutalism, and some to their own personal experience or that of the author. But there was a consistent, deep structure valuing concrete experience over abstract reformism. Hall and crew doubted that these concrete experiences are all that concrete, since, for example, they seem to refer to abstract notions like those of human nature, and of course, the press helped to form these experiences. The letters to the local press in Birmingham are also unusual. Some even refer to a Marxist model to explain the events. But there are also plenty of traditional letters with themes of moral discipline written by respectable individuals who have distanced themselves from their colleagues. Funnily enough, liberal-leaning letters tended to be twice as long because they had to argue harder for their points. Some people actually wrote private letters to the families of the muggers, and these show a broader level of public opinion, something more like a moral majority. They can be seen as clear and condensed versions of public ideology, sometimes with additional personal experience. These ones often referred to racial aspects of the events, sometimes even mentioning a number of outgroups. They often fell into the revengist category, advocating brutal punishments and pursuing racial and sexual themes. Often, abusive stereotypes enabled sadistic vengeance, simple versions of evil, people as vermin, so on and so forth. The opinions themselves seem to have been formed before the specific effects of the media on the issue, from a reservoir of common sense and received wisdom, which the media crystallized and raised to a public level. Hall and company still seem uncertain about this process, though, and want to see the media as still largely to blame. They talk of a convergence between public opinion and the media, claiming that both are informed by ideological structures and by a limited repertoire of frameworks and explanations. There are lots of differences between the two, of course, and no one single ideology, but all are generated by a limited set of ideological paradigms, themes, premises, assumptions, and the questions presuming answers, the matrix of ideas, if you will. Chapter 6, Crime, Law, and the State, opens with the question, what are the core images and ideologies of crime or in images of society? Hall posits that traditionalist ideologies seem universal because they don't reflect or correspond to different positions and experiences. Respectability, as an ideology, is a very good example. Apparently, it's universal, but for the middle class, it stands for competitive success, while for the working class, it values work over poverty and crime. It's also one of the moral issues that divide the roughs and the respectables. This is a distinction between the working class in the UK that I didn't get either. Since respectability is also valued by the middle class, it acts as what Gramsci calls cement between the classes. Work is central to self-esteem in both classes, and can lead to a condemnation of unearned income in particular. Discipline is also seen as a natural characteristic, even if it's accompanied by a sense of irony. Again, it's one of those values that crosses class membership and notes respectability with a deference to authority. There are contradictions within this, though, as in the splits between the traditional and differential working class conservatives. Zooming outward, we look at more general images. There's the city as an image of civilization and offers a particular sense of space for the proletariat. changes in the city help focus other dislocations. Then there's the broader image of England as a place of tolerance, moderation, and solid values. Of course, this is all connected to imperialism and a sense of superiority over foreigners. The law has an unambiguous and contradictory image. It represents an ideal society, and it raises awareness of oppression. This reflects the ambiguities towards crime, so that theft from shops is okay, but not theft from friends. In this way, the law is both a buttress of some native code of justice and an interference with it. Crime is perceived as a real problem. After all, there are working class victims of it, so that the traditional attitude has a real objective basis in working class experience. However, bourgeois ideology plays upon the fear of crime to reproduce capitalism. To this end, a proper history of law and jurisprudence yields a Marxist account. There was an early view that crime was an indicator of social order, leading to a positivist revolution searching for the causes of crime, and a specialized study of it in criminology, designed to lead to changes in policy. Assumptions, of course, were still psychologistic and individualistic, with social factors appearing only as matters exempting people from individual responsibilities. This still underpins the view that social accounts of crime are soft, permissive, or intellectual. This issue again has a rational core, since the welfare state in Britain has not largely supported the respectable working class. The ambiguity is extended to views of crime specifically for liberals, leading to a marked absence of their spokespersons from debates about particularly spectacular crimes. In conclusion, such arguments might have helped to break the simple conspiracy theory linking the ruling class in the media, and have done much to challenge the view of a single coherent English ideology. Underneath the apparent universality are antagonisms, showing a struggle for hegemony focused on this central issue of the problem of authority. Hall and friends now argue for a different level of analysis, going beyond crime and building on a general theory of crisis in the state, based on Gramsci. Chapter 7 is From the Control Culture to the State, and once again opens with the question, why did mugging appear as a particular phenomenon? On the surface, it arose from tensions between the police and black people, rather than from an increase in street crime as such. Plenty of other moral panics included a concern about rising crime, so the reaction to crime should be a starting point. Hall and all aren't saying that the episodes were invented, and they're not making any attempt to excuse them. They are interested, though, in why there was such an overreaction, and for this they think we should look at the structure of society as a whole. Perhaps labeling theory, as in transactional labeling, is responsible for this increase in crime. Hall believed that larger and wider forces are also at work, not just those at the micro level. There are specific issues, of course, like the issue of normal and political crime and control. Historical examples focus on political crimes like Chartism. These were clearly fluid and highly politicized matters, which shoppers focus on the process of criminalization. It's easy to get universal disapproval for criminal offenses, of course. Lots of ideological work was needed to insist that Chartism involved criminal offenses. Occasionally, we witness transitions the other way too, when political offenses are decriminalized after the struggle. However, at the end, the criminal law is the last defense of private property, and there's always a rough harmony between the law and the interests of the dominant class. This is often disguised under the false unity and camouflage of authority, often in order to educate the subordinate class. The law is also rationalized in itself and is unable to be openly partisan. Thus, there were working class victories. But still, these were merely regional histories of the capitalist state. Such victories could also be seen as functional or as upholding the right of universal criticism or whatever. The law in welfare parliamentary democracies operates in the conjuncture of the crisis in hegemony. We need to understand this via a detour into Marx's general concepts of civil society and political economy. The law may be determined in the long term, but it also displays unevenness and relative autonomy. The law appears as a moderator, above the class struggle, and this relative autonomy guarantees its ultimately reproductive role. Hall and all cite the Marxist concept of Darstellung here, which means a complex rather than an expressive totality. We know that Marxist analysis warned us of the dangers of taking this surface as the real. It is applied to the commodity. The misleading appearances of wages or of surpluses,
the positivism of bourgeois economics or of conventional views of the state. The role of the state in maintaining hegemony is only one aspect of its function. Gramsci saw the state in general as making civil society conform to the economic structure. Specifically in capitalism, it does this via the free institutions, labor, the markets, and so on. The system needs control at other levels in the economic, especially a judicial apparatus to manage private property and contract, an educational system to reproduce labor, a cultural apparatus to ensure conformity. The state produces order and cohesion, discipline as well as coercion. The legal system educates. It's an instrument to create a new civilization, which is only possible if it earns a large measure of consent. Hegemony, defined here as a universalization of class interests, is achieved via the state, since the state is crucial in the formation of alliances and supplies the necessary means to extract costs from dominant groups in the interests of the system as a whole. The state is an organ that can compromise when necessary and manage unequal equilibria. It therefore must have relative autonomy and cannot act merely as a committee of the bourgeoisie. The system needs regulation by some ideal total capitalist. The state regulates through ideology, culture, and politics. It preserves the invisibility of class, promoting instead the idea of citizenship, or can be some general will. Political concepts come to dominate other ideological spheres too, including the law, the most autonomous and the most authoritarian sector precisely because of its close tie to the state. This explains the autonomy of the law and how it is able to displace its direct partisan control onto other spheres. Its long-term function to preserve capital, the way it conceals non-legal differences, the way it presents the social relations of the state in a legitimate form. It also explains the connection between law and order. The current consensus indicates the success of this attempt at domination, the result of naturalizing class struggle. But there is still crisis in Britain, arising from a clash of particulars, but generalized. This crisis has led to a tilt towards coercion as an exceptional moment and eventually maybe to an authoritarian consensus, although this runs the risk that it will unmask general interests and therefore polarize society. Now we're on to the real doozy of the book. The actual majority of page time is devoted to chapters 8 and 9, which are both about law and order in society. First up is chapter 8, which is the law and order society, the exhaustion of consent. We need an economic analysis, but none is available, so Hall and friends start at the superstructural level. The Panic About Mugging shows a shift from consensual to coercive views of society from the post-war period to the 1970s. By focusing on ideology and defining it as Althusser does, as a real relation but also as imaginary, the media is one key terrain which is relatively autonomous and which thus reproduces these contradictions and struggles. We can understand the moral panic as a surface manifestation of crisis, as the key ideological form in which the crisis is fought out, as the main way to win the consent of the silent majority to an increasingly coercive use of the state. Lots of moral panics refer to social, moral aspects of social life, which are generalized and amplified, which produce a societal reaction from the control culture, and which then lead to a general panic about social order. These in turn lead to various law and order campaigns. For example, those of Heath and Nixon. In this way, moral panics are maintained from the top, leading to an increasing control posture by the state. Amplification takes place via signification spirals, including the convergence of two or more activities, as in student hooliganism, for example. In reality, there are some convergences between politics and crime, of course, as in left-wing campaigns for gay rights. However, criminalizing political activity is a substitute for argument. It demonstrates an ideological function. It legitimizes control culture. The process involves thresholds. There's an escalation to the next level if a low threat is amplified above a certain threshold, as when deviance becomes illegal. The presence of violence, all potential for it, seems to be important here. Escalation is often described in terms of notions of soft drugs as the thin end of a wedge, or a demonstration as incipient riot. This process can be found in the analysis of two newspaper articles in particular. We then get a very detailed summary and analysis of labor and political movements in Britain in the 60s and 70s and how they were fought back by the state and by ideology. Rather than summarizing these 40 pages in detail, we're just going to skip to the conclusion. It is a very compelling analysis, but essentially, Hall and his friends come to the conclusion that all these labor movements were beaten back by the state and by a number of non-traditional apparatuses in order to maintain hegemonic power. Chapter 9, the Law and Order Society towards the Exceptional State, actually continues this story, and we get a very detailed summary and analyses of what happened and how apparatuses of control were established, how rights were cracked down upon, how Thatcherism arose, all within the paradigm of decreasing crime and building off of a latent nationalism, which had always existed in Britain, but was particularly accented in the post-war economy. It's pretty much how Thatcherism arose, and how actually the politics of mugging were then used to manufacture consent and pass all of these horrible laws, which have undoubtedly made the UK a worse place for most people. I particularly appreciate how the book spends so much time setting this up before it just in detail analyzes and explains how all of the ideas it's posited have directly contributed to this reality, because often in a lot of theoretical pieces like this, it's kind of hard to see a direct link between what the person's talking about, what cultural theory they're applying, and how it manifests. And here is a textbook example, absolutely wonderful application of all of that. But I'm not going to summarize 100 pages of British history in detail. So, in general, Thatcherism happened, I think, is the good takeaway. Finally, we turn to the modern day, which is 1978, when this book is being finished up, and we get kind of a call to action with, it's clear there's a crisis now. Britain's economic base is uneven, in the process of being transformed to late capitalism. There's a struggle for hegemonic leadership from different blocs and alliances. On the left, laborism has become a hegemonic alternative to run capitalism. The crisis grows from the emergence of the state as a major regulator, escalating economic conflicts into political ones. There is a crisis in popular consent and social authority, leading to alternatives such as managed dissensus, which is necessary drift to repression. But this coercive management also wins consent from below, as in the notion of legitimate coercion. The state offers a sense of direction to replace a sense of loss. Ruling class misrecognitions are linked to misconceptions of crisis and popular consciousness. These events arise in two stages. First, displacement, where false resolutions of problems are achieved in moral panics, a first phenomenal form. Then follows convergence, where isolated issues become a general conspiracy, leading to a law and order society with the new expanded state to countervail, and iron times to get us all through the crisis. Chapter 10, The Politics of Mugging, takes it all home. Mugging has been dealt with from the perspective of society rather than the perspective of the individual, and we have seen outlined the formal possibility of an explanation. Mugging was never entirely a problem of black youth, but largely one. How did this happen? It was not apparent at first, although it was implied by locating mugging in places where black people live. A policy of increasing policing in black areas also linked crime to black ghettos. Race was never mentioned even explicitly then, but appeared in discussions of environmental causes and penal issues. The discussions hardened into a simple social problem perspective linked to a recognition of the alienation of West Indian youth even in police reports. The race and class aspects of the crisis were synchronized. Increasing harassment of black youths politicized them, and black people tended to be poor and unemployed, the first victims of recession. So, policing black people became equivalent to policing the crisis. The conversion of the police themselves to seeing this as a social problem could be seen as an attempt to shift the blame back to the politicians. There are general mechanisms at work to racialize the crisis too. Regular routine discrimination against black people, schools as reproducing the social relations, even if there's some resistance. Black cultural capital is particularly devalued in the culture of the school, via struggles over language, for example. Black people are discriminated against at work. Black people are more subject to de-skilling or likely to appear in the reserve army of the unemployed, more likely to appear as migrant workers with fewer rights. A harassment and unsettling process towards such workers can be seen as driven by the requirements of capital. There are also residential issues and factors, including an inability to get housing. This produces splits amongst black people, and also indicates the long history of using race to split the working class socially. These factors operate at the structural level, and so are resistant to policies designed to change attitudes or piecemeal reforms. To the impact of the Third World, traditional Marxism also denies an exclusive role to the proletariat. Fanon in this sense, is the most important writer. For him, the underclass is revolutionary, or at least they can be won over for revolutionary organization for. Phenotalism is an important feature in American black consciousness, and the colonial war is an important metaphor for the urban struggle, as in the concept internal colony. This metaphor had to be adopted rather than making a classic appeal to the proletariat, since race is an essential mode of experience. The Black Panthers just had to find a role for the hustler as the only positive role model, compared to the more negative options for black people. This strategy was not only affirmative of the life of the community, but was intended to transform it and harness the power latent in that community. To summarize, we must go beyond acts to examine conditions, to look at the structures affecting black youth, to examine a race, class, and reproduction, and how black people became secondary. The crisis occurs on all three levels: economic, political, and ideological, so that crime is one perfectly predictable and quite comprehensible consequence. Crime is not the best solution, however, and there is a need to stop the criminalization of all black people. Nevertheless, race is the form in which black people become conscious and experience themselves as living in an internal colony, and this can produce activities which look criminal. Of course, crime itself is not a political act, but it can be an expression of oppositional class consciousness. Wagelessness is an example of making a virtue out of necessity. It is a proto-political act, but it is not a fully developed confrontation with capital. Black people are sub-proletarians, a reserve army, migrant labor. Describing them as lumpenproletarians is only one way to grasp their position, and one which misses the political and ideological levels and the potential for resistance there. There is a struggle to change criminal into political forms. The solution emerges in struggle itself. Race is central at each level. Race is the central modality, the major medium through which class is experienced. Race offers real relations with real effects. It is not just a diversion from class relations. Sectionality is a necessary defensive strategy, since it is impossible at the moment to unify the struggles of the black and white working class, although whole class action is needed. Crime is a material practice which separates and lends ideological strength to political separation, and this is the problem and for black defenders of criminals. The debates about mugging confirm the separations, but is connected to work refusal, which is a viable political strategy. Black people can be an important political force, even though they failed in Algeria and in the USA. There, they lacked an active politics, a struggle, a strategy to turn quasi-rebellion into politics. At best, they developed a proto-political consciousness rather than an organized political class struggle. They need to break with the system and transform it. Well, I guess that brings us to the end of Policing the Crisis. I was not expecting the turn sort of at the very end there. I think it's important to consider that emerging within its time, certainly, but all the analysis is salient, I think, for the most part. I certainly understand why this book is still widely taught in graduate programs. As far as the works that I've read from the Birmingham Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies and the like, this is by far the most three-dimensional and comprehensive analysis I've seen. We really get from the very beginning how the notions of mugging might be posited into the public consciousness, all the way to the crimes themselves and the mediatization surrounding them, to how they were allowed to happen, how the political system functions, how the legal system functions, and how this all serves to demonize black people and the working class on so many different levels, and eventually gave birth to fascism. I mean, Thatcherism. I will say, I don't know if I'd recommend reading the entire book at this moment in time. It is a very interesting study. It's very well written, very well argued. It's incredible seeing how basically every concept that I learned about prior to this time, this is a little before, I think, some of the more interesting post-structuralist developments in theory that the Birmingham School have either pushed against or adopted, came into circulation. But as far as like the immediate post-Frankfurt brand of neo-Marxist theory, this is, I think, one of the best real-world applications I've encountered. It is certainly a doozy, though. Hall and his friends are not easy to read. A lot of details here, a lot of incredibly long sentences, a lot of data, a lot of assumptions on their part that you just know everything about Britain at the time, about some of the cases they're referencing. about a lot of Marxist theory. They don't go out of their way to explain some of the more basic ideas here. So, and even despite that, the book is like 400 pages. I think I feel accomplished having read it, and it feels really cool to see all the Birmingham stuff applied in a real world manner. It also feels very prescient. I mean, I feel like aside from the specific analysis of Britain in the 70s, you could apply a lot of this stuff to America in the 80s. You could apply a lot of this stuff to America in the 2010s. It's very prescient, and I could certainly see why this is so well regarded. I can also see why this study has not been reproduced, since it really is just so comprehensive and so much, and I can only imagine how long it would take to produce anything like this. And I don't know how you'd fit in some of the more contemporary post-structuralist or aesthetic pieces of theory into this. I feel like it would be a very, very different essay, but certainly a landmark work, and honestly, probably the perfect book to end on, having read a lot of Birmingham cultural stuff over the past few months. Well, if you made it to the end of this, thanks so much. This is a fun project to do. A lot of reading theory, which isn't usually my favorite thing, but this was fun. A good experience for a number of things. Maybe when I finish my term papers, I'll throw them up on Medium, just because. Anywho, this has been myself. This has been Gallivanting Across British Cultural Studies. This is the last episode. Everyone have a good whatever time of day it is, and stay frosty, I guess. Thank you.